We are on a journey through the Venetian Republic, and having already covered a lot of ground, we are heading south out of Croatia. Now, I realise 6 episodes plus the couple on Dubrovnik / the Republic of Ragusa doesn't seem like a long time, but with all the research these have needed, plus scrubbing through close to a terabyte worth of footage. By the way, even though they didn't come out in this order, to understand the immediate context of this area, do go and watch the Dubrovnik episode, and particularly the episode about Ston and the wider Republic. Because Dubrovnik's whole thing was decidedly not being in the Republic of Venice, it's separate to this season, but it's in the playlist along with the other episodes so far. So yes, do some catching up if this is all a bit new. And hey, if you're feeling obliging, you'd be helping us out a lot if you'd leave a like and a comment on this. But to be honest, I'm just most happy when people are actually seeing our episodes. So just go on a spree through the Venetian Republic episodes. That would make our day. But getting into Montenegro, and the more things change, the more they stay the same. So while of course some of the history is different in this region, a lot of the tidal forces of various empires and powers did affect the area at similar times and similar ways to what we've seen so far. If there was any doubt, then much like the rest of the story to this point, Venetian control was confined principally to the coast, not making it much further inland. And since Montenegro has just these vertical walls of mountains almost the moment you get out of the water, yeah, this often greatly impedes the progress you can make inland, so it's not all that surprising two areas not that many miles apart on a flat map could still end up controlled by different powers. Before we get into specifics, I started running into a problem writing this script. With the sequence I'd be telling you the information, it was just all arriving in the wrong order. So while north to south this week we'd be going to Herceg Novi, round Perast, and finishing up in Kotor, with how everything unfolded, it was just going to make a lot more sense to start with Kotor and work our way back. This should become apparent as we start in antiquity and give some context. And to trip us up further, the modern state of Montenegro and its borders are not all that helpful as a lens for us to understand this area in antiquity or medieval times. I'm sure I'm not going to get the finer points of this correct to anyone's satisfaction, but the modern state of Montenegro was germinated out of a comparatively tiny nucleus, roughly corresponding to the area around Cetinje and Mount Lovćen, which, when it was formerly covered in trees, gave the impression of a black mountain, hence the name Montenegro. But yes, case in point, despite Cetinje and the early beginnings of Montenegro being geographically close to Kotor, historically the status quo was different powers controlling different portions. And just to underline the differing understanding of the region, this one's actually kind of funny, just to really mess with us, this area, you see this? This coastal area was known as, wait for it, Venetian Albania. Yeah, just to really confuse matters. While, initially Venetian Albania did control a fair chunk of what we now recognise as the North Albanian coast, by 1573, Venetian Albania had contracted all the way back to Budvar, entirely confined to what we'd now call Montenegro. But let's not get ahead. Probably should have had a...
Spoilers from history.
I've given away the entire Albanian story and we've scarcely set foot out of Croatia. Okay, anyway, as we always do, let's wind back to antiquity and have a bit of context for the area. Before we go any further, can we just acknowledge that for people like me of a certain generation, when you hear Kotor, it means this generally well-beloved video game series? The Bay of Kotor makes an appearance in the accounts of the Illyro-Roman Wars. What's now Rissan is referenced as an Illyrian stronghold of Queen Tuta. The Romans would build settlements here. There are some impressive mosaics you can visit in Rissan. They would also build the settlement of Ascrivium further round the bay at what is now Kotor. In 535, the Emperor Justinian, having expelled the Goths, would reportedly fortify the heights above the town. Now, I would love to show you some of this Byzantine fortress, but there's no indication a brick survives below the vast Venetian defences later built there. And showing this on screen right now is not really comparing like for like. It's a bit like describing the Romans building a bridge over the Thames and then flashing up Tower Bridge as a visual reference. Anyway, De Administrando Imperio would describe a Rosa, or Rissan, fortress and a lower fortress of Decaterra, which is interpreted to be describing the lakeside town and the fortress above it. De Administrando Imperio also suggests that these lands had virtually been emptied following Avar raids. We have records of a bishop at Rissan up to 595, and then nothing else to go on. You can see how, in an inland area that's already difficult to traverse and where survival is going to hinge on trade networks, organised urban settlements may have dwindled to little more than tiny communities of herders. To whatever degree the population had diminished or vanished, the Emperor Heraclius is recorded to have repopulated the area with Slavs. So whether there was any continuity from the original Roman population or whether the old town and fortress was reoccupied by the Slavs moving into the area isn't recorded. The details from De Administrando Imperio, something for which we are long overdue to start using an acronym, come as it describes the Saracen attack in 866. It had already wrecked Budvar and would later go on to besiege Dubrovnik for 15 months before, in a twist, the Byzantine navy came to their aid. We already said it, watch the Dubrovnik episode, not right now, but soon. In 1002, another sacking came, this time by the Bulgarians under Tsar Samuel, and he would gift the area to the Serbians. The following centuries in Kotor would be checkered by a patchwork of alliances with different powers in the region and different attempts at being an independent city, in a similar mould to what Ragusa was attempting. Both cities were looking to operate commerce with a degree of autonomy, and around 1320, during the period where Dubrovnik was under the control of Venice, the Venetians tried to forbid the two cities from trading in an attempt to protect its own mercantile interests. But since the Treaty of Zadar would remove the Venetian yoke from Dubrovnik in 1358, this would soon be reversed. With numerous powers eyeing Kotor, it came under the protection of Hungary in 1370, but this was not sufficient to protect them when, in 1378, the Venetian fleet, fresh from a victory against the Genoese in the Chioggia War and under the command of Vittorio Pisani, opted to use the fleet to capture Kotor and later Šibenik as well. The Republic of Ragusa lent a hand in what became a local uprising against Venetian rule. It wasn't until 1381 that Kotor was back under the protection of Hungary, but it was just poor timing, and over the next couple of decades, all the major names in the region were undergoing major change. After its zenith in territorial expansion, the power and territory of Serbia was deflating, and meanwhile Bosnia, under Tvitko, was looking to exert itself. And there was even the rather unimpressive attempt by Ladislaus of Naples at claiming the Hungarian throne. Kotor was conscious of its vulnerability to both Venice, the rising power of the Ottomans, and even the Bolshici nobles who controlled Zeta around much of what is now Montenegro, but none of its preferred local allies could provide sufficient protection. And eventually, after some back and forth, Kotor was obliged to ask for Venice's protection, and it came under the Venetian state in July of 1420, where it would stay until the end of the Republic. The town, as it stands, is a show-stopping example of Venetian fortification works. It's a UNESCO site, it's part of the inscription of Venetian defences that included Zadar and St Nicholas Fort at Šibenik. What can you say about Kotor? It's a truly exhilarating place to be. I discussed it in our shorter episode on Montenegro a couple of years back when we just had a day trip, and ever since then I had been impatient to get back and spend more time. We'll discuss the fortifications in a bit, but first a few sites within the town. Part of what makes these towns in Montenegro feel different to the others we've so far seen in the Adriatic is the introduction of Serbian Orthodox churches. I must admit it's not a topic about which I know very much, but the domes with a certain distinctive eastern flair are rather captivating. Along the northern wall, you can see the dome of St Nicholas Church just protruding above the walls, though considering its looks, it's a surprisingly recent addition, a 1902 rebuild of a church from 1810 that had burnt down. So, close to our dates of interest then, in the same square, the Church of St Luke dates to around 1195. While much smaller, it boasts some beautiful Romanesque details and the apse at the back. Of all the churches within the town, the particular highlight is the Cathedral of St Tryphon. Built on the foundations of an earlier church from 809, the new cathedral was consecrated in 1166, and kind enough to print this on the outer wall in case anyone forgets. There are some lovely Romanesque, or perhaps neo-Romanesque details around the edge, as there's clearly been restoration. It took quite a lot of damage in the 1667 earthquake that all but levelled Dubrovnik, and the 1979 Montenegrin earthquake as well. What else? Well, the clock tower you see when you enter via the sea gate is Venetian era from 1602. All in all, from our first visit, I described Kotor as very immersive. Without cataloguing every Venetian-era structure in the town, Kotor's tight streets are wonderful to get lost in, though thanks to its compact size, you won't need to fret about leaving a trail of breadcrumbs. You'll find your way out in no time. So, okay, we got to talk about the walls. While Kotor was fortified as far back as Justinian's work in the 500s, the Venetians undertook a massive programme of works beginning in the 1400s and continuing through the 1500s. Beginning at the north, you get this stunning vanishing point across the emerald green of the river Skerda along the walls. The nearest bastion you can see is the Campana Tower, and while there had been a medieval tower here, this is about as Venetian in design as you can get, dating to the early 1500s. Further down, the Bembo Bastion from 1540 has now been transformed into a theatre. It's a polygonal bastion that was something of a later innovation by the Venetians, a progression away from round bastions and apparently built in the wake of the assault by Barbarossa heading an Ottoman navy in 1539. And beyond that, the River Gate, also from 1540. Further round, the Sea Gate. Now, the inscription above and the communist star commemorating its liberation from the Nazis during World War II is, of course, a later addition. The original Venetian gate dates to 1555. Now, I was so sure I'd seen references to Austrian alteration. I am now struggling to come up with any citation of this, so I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure. While this is far from concrete, can we just flash up examples of Venetian gates that were later augmented by Austrians? Cool, yeah, thanks. So, there's a covered market that conceals the wall for about 100 yards. You then pass the confusingly, or not, corner bastion, that's with a K. Finally, at the southern side, you have the Girdich Gate and bastion. What you're seeing is mainly from 1470 onwards, though the masonry on the inside may be from the early iterations from the 1200s and later. The Girdich Bastion, you can see, matches the Campana Tower almost exactly in design and form. As to the rest of the fortifications that snake up the hill, these would be impressive enough if they were at ground level, but the fact they march implacably up a sheer slope, scarcely pausing for breath, is absolutely bonkers. Wide shots are always a problem. Unlike, say, the walls of Ston that contrast with the landscape, the walls of Kotor blend extremely well with the local stones, so from afar, they are hard to make out, at least on camera. On your way up, easily the most famous photo stop, and I mean, how could you resist? The spire of Our Lady of Remedy. To save you a rabbit hole, there's a Chinese whispers detail about this being built on an older church from the 500s. This is not true, basically. Someone seems to have confused this St Mary's Church with this St Mary's Collegiate Church. And while, yes, there are apparently traces of a 500s church under here, if you see the claim about this being traces of the oldest church in Montenegro, that also appears to be not true. There's a basilica right out in the open in Budvar that's from the 400s. Anyway, back to this church from the 1500s. I am, of course, a huge fan. Further up, and this is as far as I got on my first attempt, so I was quite pleased to get up even higher. Unlike a lot of Venetian fortifications you can visit nowadays, it's at this point that sections become more derelict and unkempt. The day we were heading up, the mountains had thick, rolling mist, giving the walls a haunting Gothic quality. When the Venetians undertook their fortifying works here in the 14 and 1500s, impressive though these are, they are not a fresh work undertaken from scratch. Since the status quo of upper fortress and lower town had existed way into antiquity, in fact, even before Justinian and the Romans built there, it's believed that there was an Illyrian fortress up on these heights. Now, I found a frustrating lack of sources that will talk much about the chronology of fortifications here. Even the UNESCO report comments on the lack of investigations done on this part. However, it's believed that the Venetian works are following the line of earlier walls pretty much exactly. So while their height and scope is no less impressive for it, this was not being done ex nihilo, but part of a huge upgrade to whatever fortifying works already connected the upper fortress with the lower town. When you reach St John's Fort at the top, as with many fortifications along this stretch of coast, you can most clearly see the more recent Austro-Hungarian additions. As a rule, the Venetian work was done in stone and lime mortar. Anything you see in concrete or other materials is likely Austro-Hungarian. I think we are in dire need of a Kotor supercut. Going to take our time with this one. sharp-eyed of you may have noticed on our first trip, I was actually under the impression that you could go all the way up from the northern side and then down to the south, but actually this stretch is not currently accessible. The walls are in need of some attention from a mixture of neglect following the end of the Austro-Hungarian rule in 1918 and the major earthquake of 1979, which left all of Kotor needing major repair work. It's not impossible that a footpath and some steps could be cut into this hillside, but as it stands, the walls on the southern side below the fortress are not accessible, at least not without some pretty enthusiastic free climbing. It's stiff competition to label the most impressive Venetian fortifications still surviving, but from sheer verticality alone, Kotor makes for a strong contender. And they really had it where it counts, as despite all that happened in the region over the centuries of Venetian rule, it stood fast against 3 different Ottoman assaults. One by Barbarossa in August of 1539 with a force of 30,000 that had already taken Herceg Novi, another in 1571 and another in 1657. So while it was extremely costly to do so, Venice's efforts to make a steadfast bulwark in the area paid off. So that's Kotor. Onwards, back around the bay, we get to Perast. Now, going into the history of Perast, it's tempting to conflate its story with that of the town of what is now Rissan, formerly Rhizon, the Illyrian then Roman settlement. After all, there's only about 2 kilometers between them, and while the Roman sites in Rissan are fantastic, the current town is mostly quite modern, and by contrast, Perast has all this gorgeous Venetian architecture, but nothing of significant antiquity. Yeah, after Avar raids ostensibly wiped Rhizon off the map following 595, as best we can determine, there were no major settlements here for the next few turbulent centuries. I mean, Kotor was attacked and sacked many times by different powers. Any unfortified settlement here by the lakeside would have been severely exposed. So you get to 1326, you have a minor fishing settlement with maybe a shipyard opposite a somewhat noteworthy church on an island. By some accounts, the only structure from around the Kotor area left standing after the Mongol invasions of the 1200s was this, the Church of St. George on the island there. Though, regards Kotor itself, that might be something of an overstatement, as Kotor bounced back pretty quickly. So before the 1300s, there's not a tremendous amount happening on this site specifically. You know, I'll be honest. Sometimes when I'm researching, I come to realise there's a crucial detail I'd missed and it massively reframes the story. Let's just zoom out a second. First of all, I thought that Venice had control of this whole coast and then it just dovetailed into the Republic of Ragusa when you get to the Convale region. Now that's largely true post 1687. But, I mean, come on, it makes sense, right? Kotor is fortified here, and so, you know, no surprise if they've managed to secure the Bay of Kotor and... Wait, hang on. So, in 1481, not only did the Ottomans take Herceg Novi, but also Rissan. So, they had a foothold inside the Bay of Kotor. Now, look, there's a lot to unpick, and I don't want to take too long over this. Can't lie, this was a surprise. I had just naturally assumed that with control of Perast and Kotor, Venice would at the very least have this sheltered inland sea locked down. And I can't claim to have all the answers on this. There's not a huge amount that I've been able to dig up in terms of records, but okay, a few general notes. If you visit Rissan nowadays, the Ottomans did not fortify it or make it into a great military stronghold. There is a fort way up on the hill above, but in the same way the Sultan sent Barbarossa, the infamous pirate, with a fleet to retake Herceg Novi, they seem mostly content to use Rissan as a base for piracy as opposed to all-out war. And it has to be said, because of the terrain, access over land to Rissan is far from straightforward. So while the Ottomans had the territory contiguous between there and Herceg Novi, it was not a simple matter to transport troops or, for example, artillery. And mirroring the Ottoman response, while Perast took on new significance as a border town and flourished significantly, the Venetians didn't exactly fortify it very vigorously. So yeah, it's a puzzle. 2 towns, only 2 kilometers away. The road that connects the two was undoubtedly not there. So while, sure, I mean, you've got to hop on a boat, I mean, 2 kilometers, it's not much. Anyway, the town of Perast. Perast is desperately pretty and knows it. This is partly down to a prohibition on modern buildings being built there, and yes, without this, it would pretty much look like Herceg Novi or any of the other towns from around here, or in fact any other town along the Adriatic actually. Instead, we get this gorgeous town preserved remarkably close to its original Venetian form. I know we normally save this for near the end, but I'm actually going to insert a supercut here. Perast became a noteworthy maritime school where Venice would train some of its future mariners. Famously, Peter the Great of Russia, with his great project of incorporating European innovations into the Russian state, sent some of his men to be schooled at Perast. I'm not going to be listing off all of the palaces here. I'm trying to get away from being completionist. There's plenty of them, and they're all gorgeous. While building a fortifying wall around Perast was mooted, the plan never really materialised, and instead, they built a few fortified towers within the town. Perhaps, given the vast resources Venice had pumped into turning Kotor into like an uber fortress, they decided against building a smaller, less robust fortress further down in this more exposed area. Eventually, they did build a structure higher up in the town, the Fortress of St. Cross, which, while originally built in 1570 with remodelling later in 1628 and later again with some alterations by the Austrians, the single most distinctive landmark of Perast has to be the Church of St. Nicholas. Built in 1616, replacing an earlier church from 1564, with the spire built in 1691. We did get a chance to climb the Campanile, which really does afford you some of the best views of the town and the bay. And we need to just briefly mention the churches out on the islands. Feels a little unfair, really. The island of St. George, with its history stretching back nearly a millennia, but everyone's too busy flirting with its cute younger sister, which isn't even a proper island. Our Lady of the Rocks has a legendary story about its founding concerning an icon, but like, who has time? It was made by sinking ships filled with rocks, and by 1630 there was enough mass there to build a platform and put the church on top of that. Meanwhile, St. George is the far more ancient of the two, with foundations as early as the 1100s. But heading out of this part of the bay, we finally get to Herceg Novi. You might recognise Novi as meaning new, and the city was known as Castel Nuovo, or Newcastle, the occupants all presumably speaking in the Montenegrin equivalent of a Geordie accent. The Herceg part, that's harder to pass as an English speaker. It's a Slavic form of Herzog, the German title, somewhat equivalent to Duke. Vague? Yes, well... Further along the Dalmatian coast, Šibenik was somewhat considered as the new kid on the block, having been established by Slavs sometime around or before 1000 AD, as opposed to the ancient Greek or Roman roots of Trogir, Zada, and others. So Herceg Novi having been established in just 1382. Gasp! I know, yeah, just imagine. As part of the expansion of what became the Kingdom of Bosnia at the end of the 1300s, partly thanks to the crumbling of the Serbian Empire, Tvitko was looking to gain a foothold on the coast, and without major settlements in the area, and having previously both failed to take Kotor and being embargoed by the Republic of Ragusa, he built his own fortress at what is now Herceg Novi. Tvitko's son, Stepan, made Castel Nuovo the winter seat of his court, and this is where it picked up the Herceg part, thanks to his title. I mean, like I said, don't get too hung up on it. However, just 100 years after its founding, in December of 1481, the city was taken by the Ottomans. They would rule it along with this side of the bay for 200 years, with the exception of just 1 year. In 1538, the Holy League, which we'll have to devote more time to elsewhere. Basically, it was an attempt at an anti-Ottoman alliance that came with mixed results. The Holy League landed and took Herceg Novi, but while Venice, unsurprisingly, wanted to add it to its possessions, it instead was garrisoned by 5,000 Spanish troops on behalf of Charles V. They held it from 1538 till August of 1539, where it fell to a major Ottoman assault. Thanks to the previous slight, which had pretty much caused Venice to leave the Holy League, which somewhat scuppered its chances anyway, the Venetians declined to assist the garrison, and the Ottomans would hold Herceg Novi until 1687 and the Mauryan War. Herceg Novi, in fact, has 3 forts, and I'm embarrassed to say I missed one of them, just straight up missed it. You may all boo in unison. Known as Spagnola, or the Spanish fort, it dates from the Holy League capture of the town, but in fact, in the year the garrison was present, they only really managed to lay the foundations before losing the town. So almost all the work you're seeing is Ottoman, a square design with round towers at all the corners. The Venetians did add an extra bit, most confusingly, to the outside, but in their defence, the inside was already a bit tight for space. Anyways, without our own photos, I'm going to move on to the rest of the town. On your way into the town from the west, you're greeted with this rather spectacular set of steps, and surprisingly, this tower actually dates from 1667, while the town was still under Ottoman rule. Though you can see it's been restored. I mean, the clock, for example, is from 1995. As mentioned before, you start to see more Serbian Orthodox churches in Montenegro, and this one in the square is particularly striking, even if not all that large in footprint, being built in 1912. While there's not really a good vantage to see this, Herceg Novi is one connected defensive system with walls running the length from Canli Kula Fort all the way down to the water and the Forte Mare. And then a modern resort city just spread out in all directions around it. Firstly, the Canli Kula, which means bloody towers, thanks to its reputation as something of a jail of no return. It was built after the recapture of the town in 1539, though almost certainly on the site of earlier fortifications. I've not been able to find a detailed breakdown of which parts are Ottoman construction and what are the Venetian upgrades. The interior is now dominated by banked seating, and various events and concerts are hosted there. The fortification system pokes through at various points in the town. For example, the horseshoe tower that extends outwards from the line of walls. At the bottom of the town, the Forte Mare, or Sea Fort, is a particularly daunting structure with a vantage and impressive field of fire to the entrance of the bay. The UNESCO nomination describes that following Venetian control of the town, the focus of defence shifted from the defence of the heights, primarily around the Spagnola fort, to defence of the shoreline, making the Forte Mare the most significant part of the system. Okay, lion watch time. If there were lions in Herceg Novi, I didn't catch them in the short time we were there, so sorry. Moving around to Perast, there's this church, and halfway up it has... wow, I mean... that is just so gross to look at. I mean, genuine contender for the worst we've seen so far. It looks closer to a rather disgusted looking bat than a lion, or possibly some godforsaken off-brand action figure. Heading round to Kotor, there's this, mounted just opposite the land gate, has a puzzlingly fishy face. And a short distance away, actually undercover by the market, there's this rather smug-looking lion. Like, that's right, unlike all the other lions, I have a crest. Finally, further up the St. John's Wall, you have this guy just looking utterly terrified, has absolutely gazed into the abyss. Well, there's another episode of Montenegro coming soon, and while I was back and forth on whether we do this, there's also going to be a travel episode on our journey through Montenegro with some definite surprises along the way. Meanwhile, do us a solid and head to bandcamp.com to find all the music you've been hearing behind this episode. We appreciate all the likes and comments, but you'd really be doing us the biggest favour if you'd support us by purchasing the music we've made. You can also subscribe. There's an exciting snowballing happening on the channel right now. The Venetian episodes are proving a little slow out of the door in terms of viewers, but some of our other episodes have taken off in ways we never expected. So huge thanks to everyone who's supported us so far. Find us on the social medias, and otherwise we'll catch you very soon.